Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today to engage in this debate. And before I do, I'll just let the House know that I'll be splitting my time with a hardworking member from Edmonton Centre. Mr. Speaker, I have before me the bill, and I do have some notes that I'll refer to in a bit just to talk about those. But I think one of the important pieces of Bill C-51 comes in the preamble of the bill, and I'll read directly from it. It says, whereas activities that undermine the security of Canada are often carried out in a clandestine, deceptive, or hostile manner, are increasingly global, complex, and sophisticated, and often emerge and evolve rapidly. Mr. Speaker, we have an obligation here in Parliament to make sure that when we're asking our law enforcement agencies in this country and our security intelligence services in Canada to deal with these ever-evolving, complex, and changing threats, that we provide them the mechanisms to do so, to ask them to keep up with the evolution of these threats, the sophistication of them, with one hand tied behind their back, is both irresponsible as a government, it is unfair to them, and it is unfair to all Canadians. But to assure everyone, and Canadians participating by watching this debate, in the preamble itself, and embedded throughout the 63 pages of Bill C-51, all of them I've read, studied, and in fact gone over multiple times, it states that information that's relevant to the security of Canada is to be shared in a manner that is consistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the protection of privacy. That's embedded in the very beginning of this legislation, and it's in fact consistent throughout in a number of the sections, and I'm sure I'll have time to go over those and some of the questions members may pose for me. But Mr. Speaker, Canadians do want strong action to deal with the jihadi terrorists that are existing today globally and indeed are affecting our country. And that's exactly what we're doing with the Anti-Terrorism Act 2015 and why I'm proud to support it. The bill does four concrete things. They create a mechanism for internal government information sharing for the purpose of protecting national security. They modernize the passenger Protect program, that's colloquially known as the no-fly list, and it criminalizes the production and dissemination of jihadist propaganda. And it gives CSIS some new tools to stop terrorist threats before they end in tragedy. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that the international jihadist movement has declared war on Canada and her allies. Canadians are being targeted by terrorists simply because they hate our society and the values that it represents. Jihadi terrorism is not a human right, it's an act of war. Mr. Speaker, it's why our government has put forward measures to protect Canadians against jihadi terrorists who seek to destroy the very principles that make Canada the best country in the world to live. And that's also why Canada is no longer sitting on the sidelines. Some of us would prefer that we do that, and instead of joining our allies and supporting the international coalition in the fight against ISIL. Mr. Speaker, our government believes that it is not right to sit on the sidelines, that we have an obligation and a duty, in fact, to act, and we will. Our government has increased resources available to our police by 1/3, and we've allocated more resources to CSIS, the RCMP, and CBSA now by almost $300 million to bolster our frontline services and our efforts to counter terrorism. Our government will continue to ensure that our police forces have the resources that they need to keep Canadians safe. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to focus my remarks on the new powers for CSIS to disrupt threats before they happen. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, some of these changes are very much common sense. Oftentimes, CSIS agents are positioned to intervene at an early stage because they primarily operate in the pre-criminal space. That's when the terrorist attacks are being planned. However, and shockingly, in current day, they're prohibited from taking any action to disrupt those plots. They can only collect information. And I'm going to read a quote for you from Dr. Hazudi Jasser, the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, who said in committee, "It's amazing," and I quote here, Mr. Speaker, "it's amazing to me that disrupting is currently prohibited. Remember, disrupting doesn't mean you're arresting these individuals. You're not violating their personal property rights. You're just taking them out of commission. You're actually disrupting a plot." Now, I think, Mr. Speaker, to all Canadians, that would seem common sense, that when our security intelligence services have information that they know would have reasonable grounds to believe that, that there's a terrorist plot in the making, that they would then have the ability to somehow disrupt that plot. Now, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, that kind of action boils down to things as simple as approaching parents and speaking with those parents about a family member, a child that CSIS believes is becoming radicalized. Now, can you imagine this, Mr. Speaker, that present day, when our security intelligence services knows this information, that there is no provision in law for them to go into the home, engage in a plan, engage in discussion, and then engage in a plan to deal with that information, to stop that radicalization, to prevent that from manifesting itself further. I think Canadians would be alarmed to know that that information couldn't allow our security intelligence service to take a simple step of talking with families or people in our country to prevent a terrorist threat. You might hear instances, of course, where they currently do that, but of course that's in the context of their present mandate of intelligence gathering rather than actual threat disruption. And these are examples, of course, of threat disruption that don't require a warrant and are currently legal for anyone to do. And it wouldn't make sense, of course, for CSIS officers to require warrants in order to ask parents to speak to their children or engage in conversations in online chat rooms that are becoming more and more the mode of communication in our present day technological world. CSIS would, however, and as clearly outlined in this bill, need a judicially approved warrant for anything that would infringe on an individual's rights or any activity that could be contrary to law. Furthermore, the judge would need to be convinced that such powers were reasonable and proportional to the threat. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, in those sections, there are more than 4 stages of approach that have to be gone through prior to those warrants being authorized. Those stages are far more onerous and far more detailed than any other provision in criminal law that a regular law enforcement officer needs to go through. How do I know that? Because I've done those myself, Mr. Speaker, as a law enforcement officer. And the provisions that I see contained in this bill in terms of the Canadian Security Intelligence Agency first even reaching the approval stage to take that matter before a judge is one full stage. They then have to demonstrate to a judge that all of the conditions would be met for a warrant to be authorized. There are no less than 8 conditions for that step to take place. Of course, the justice then has the opportunity to accept or deny that request or ask for greater information and modify it. And after and if a warrant is authorized by the justice, the CSIS personnel accepting or seeking that warrant and upon being granted that warrant, then have to ensure, under legislation, have to ensure that the conditions for which the warrant was granted still exist prior to taking any action. So there's 4 different levels with multiple conditions under each level to ensure effective and proper oversight of the granting of any action. So I know the opposition wants to fearmonger and suppose now that CSIS can all of a sudden get warrants to interrupt and access Canadians' information or all of a sudden stomp all over your rights. This has to go through a 4-stage process, including final judicial review, that puts tremendous onerous and legislative conditions on the CSIS officers. So, Mr. Speaker, I know I have limited time left, but I do know that C-51 is a bill that will ensure the right balance between the protection and preservation of Canadians' freedoms while at the same time ensuring that our law enforcement and security service agencies have the tools that they need to do in a modern context so that they can stop these threats that, as I mentioned in the preamble of this bill, are ever evolving, global in nature, changing daily, and it's our obligation as a responsible government to make sure that they have the tools to do their job to keep Canadians safe while preserving everybody's collective freedom. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.